All right, ready to dive into some serious philosophical territory. Today, we are going deep with Michel Foucault. This is a thinker who can really challenge some of your preconceptions about, well, about a lot of things. We've got some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on him to help guide our deep dive today.
Sounds fun. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, Foucault is definitely one of those thinkers who can really change how you view the world, and I'm so glad to have expert speaker with us to help guide us through some of, well, I'll just say it, Foucault can be a little dense and complex sometimes, right?
He can be, but he is incredibly insightful. And it is rewarding if you stick with it.
Yeah, for sure. So to start things off, can you give us a bit of background on Foucault? He wasn't like, your typical armchair philosopher, right?
Yeah. No, not at all. He had a really unusual path. He actually started off in psychology and the history of psychology, which is super important for understanding his later work. He was also really immersed in that exciting intellectual scene in post-war France. Existentialism was all the rage, but he ended up taking a different approach than those guys.
How so?
Well, he was interested in some of the same things, like the limits of reason, but he wasn't focused on the individual subject in the same way as, say, Sartre. He was more interested in these bigger historical and social forces that shape how we understand ourselves.
So where did he fit into, like, the landscape of French intellectual thought at the time?
Well, he was definitely connected to that strong tradition of history and philosophy of science in France. Thinkers like Bachelard and Canguilhem were big influences on him. And he was just fascinated by how knowledge is produced and how these categories we take for granted, like madness or sexuality, are really products of their historical moment.
So there's a theme of, like, critique here, right? Critiquing the things that we think we know for sure, especially in those areas that study human beings. It sounds like he was really suspicious of historical reason.
Exactly. Foucault really believed that what we might take to be universal truths about human nature or about reason itself are actually often just products of specific power structures, and these change over time throughout history.
Okay, so can you give me like a concrete example of this? How did he actually put this critique into practice?
His book, A History of Madness, is a great example of this. The standard view is that 19th century medicine made progress by treating madness as a mental illness. But Foucault, he argued that this wasn't just about some kind of simple scientific advancement. It was also about controlling and marginalizing people who didn't fit into societal norms.
Okay, so it's not that the medical knowledge was totally irrelevant, but that it was always tied up with power.
Exactly. And that takes us to another super important idea, representation, which he explores in his book, The Order of Things. In that book, he traces how the meaning of knowledge itself has changed over time in Western thought.
Hold on, could you back up a second? What exactly do you mean by representation here?
Think of it like this. How do our thoughts connect to the actual world out there? How do our ideas stand in for things? For philosophers like Descartes and Kant, thinking was basically the same thing as representing. To think of a tree, let's say, meant you had an idea in your head that accurately corresponds to a real tree out there in the world.
Right, so it's like our minds are creating this kind of map of reality.
Exactly. But Foucault argues that this model of representation starts to break down in the modern era. Kant, for example, he raised this question of how we can even be sure that our ideas actually line up with things in themselves. And this really just opened up a whole can of worms about the limits of reason and whether knowledge is shaped by factors beyond pure representation.
So it sounds like the very idea of man as a knowing subject comes into question here.
Absolutely. For Foucault, man isn't just this biological entity. It's a concept, an epistemological concept, that emerges at a particular point in history. He's interested in the conditions that made it possible for us to even think of ourselves as man, as both the subject who knows and the object to be known.
It seems like we're bumping into a kind of paradox here.
Right, and that's exactly what Foucault was interested in. Descartes' famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," that worked just fine in classical thought. But in the modern era, things get a bit more complicated. We realize that man is this finite being limited by history and biology, but at the same time is supposed to be the source of knowledge about those very things. And this is one called the analytic of finitude that Foucault was so concerned with.
So how did different thinkers try to sort of resolve that paradox?
Well, some, like naturalists and Marxists, they tried to reduce everything to the empirical. They saw man as just a product of these natural or historical forces. Others, like the phenomenologists, focused on the transcendental subject and tried to ground all knowledge in pure consciousness. But Foucault saw problems with both of these approaches.
It seems like the very categories of subject and object and knowing and being, they all start to kind of dissolve into the scrutiny.
That's right. And Foucault really thought this paradox leads to this crisis in modern thought, a collapse of what he called the modern episteme. He didn't really offer his own solution, but he did develop these new methods for analyzing how these categories we use, how they came to be.
Oh, interesting. Like what? Could you give us a little preview of what we'll talk about in the next part?
Yeah. He called one of his approaches archaeology. It's all about digging up these hidden structures of thought in different historical periods. And from there, he developed this concept of genealogy, which traces the historical processes that led to specific systems of thought and power.
This is getting really interesting. I'm
Yep.
excited to hear more about how he actually applied these methods.
We'll pick up there next time. I promise it will be fascinating. We'll get into how he used these ideas to analyze prisons, sexuality, and the nature of power itself.
Sounds like a wild ride. Buckle up, everyone, for part 2 of our deep dive on Foucault. Okay, so I'm ready to pick up where we left off. We were just getting into Foucault's methods of archaeology and genealogy.
Yes, exactly. These are really essential for understanding how he approaches, the history of thought. Archaeology is it's about unearthing those underlying rules that kind of govern discourse in a specific time and place. What can be said, who can say it, and with what authority, all that.
It's like he's digging into those unspoken assumptions, the frameworks that people just take for granted that shape how they think.
Right, exactly. And then genealogy builds on that by showing how these systems of thought emerge, but through these contingent historical events, power struggles, all of that. It's not about finding some grand narrative of progress, but understanding the messy, sometimes even contradictory forces that shape our ideas.
So it's a way of kind of deconstructing those narratives that we often tell ourselves about history.
Precisely. Foucault wants to show that what we think of as natural or inevitable is often just the outcome of specific power relations, things that could have been different.
His work on prisons seems like a really good example of this. Can you walk us through how he uses genealogy to analyze the modern prison system?
Yeah, so in Discipline and Punish, Foucault traces the shift from those really brutal public punishments to the more, quote, humane prison system. But he argues that it wasn't just about progress or people becoming more kind.
So there was something else going on underneath that.
Right. He showed how the prison emerged alongside these new forms of knowledge about criminals, new techniques for disciplining the body and the mind. It became this whole model for controlling entire populations, not just punishing individuals.
Oh, okay. I'm starting to see how that connects back to his point about knowledge and power being intertwined. The prison produces this whole discourse about crime, about punishment, and that discourse itself is a form of power.
Yeah, you got it. The prison isn't just a place to lock people up. It's like a laboratory for producing what he calls docile bodies, people who self-regulate and conform to society's norms.
Okay, that's a pretty chilling thought.
Yeah.
And he saw that model of discipline extending beyond the prison walls, right?
Absolutely. Foucault argued that this whole logic of discipline, it seeps into all these modern institutions, schools, hospitals, factories. It's everywhere. It's all about producing these individuals who are productive, obedient, easy to control.
And this brings us back to the panopticon, right? That architectural model that Foucault was so fascinated by.
Yes. The panopticon is the perfect illustration of this disciplinary power in action. You have the constant possibility of being watched. And that creates a system of self-discipline where people internalize the gaze of power and start modifying their own behavior.
It's like they're always anticipating being watched, so they end up basically policing themselves.
Exactly, exactly. And it's not even just about physical surveillance. It's about internalizing these norms and expectations, becoming subjects who conform to the dominant way of thinking, the discourse.
But isn't this a bit too, I don't know, deterministic? Are we really just puppets of these power structures?
Well, Foucault wouldn't say that. He always emphasized that power is dynamic. Wherever there's power, there's also resistance. And he was really interested in how individuals and groups can find ways to, subvert norms, challenge the dominant discourse, create spaces of freedom within these seemingly restrictive systems.
Okay, so it's not a totally hopeless situation.
Yeah.
But how do we even begin to resist these subtle forms of power that are shaping who we are?
That's where Foucault's concept of governmentality comes in. It's a way of understanding how power operates, especially in these modern societies. It's not just through repression, but through this whole range of techniques and practices that shape our conduct.
Can you maybe unpack that a little bit? What are some examples of these techniques and practices?
Okay, well, think about things like public health campaigns, economic policies, even just the ways we talk about ourselves and our identities. Governmentality isn't just about the state or the government. It's about how we govern ourselves and others, how we internalize those norms and expectations.
So it's about the ways that power becomes embedded in, like, everyday life, right?
Exactly. And Foucault argued that modern power isn't just this top-down control. It's also about shaping our desires, our beliefs, our very sense of self. It's about managing populations through knowledge, techniques, all of that.
This makes me think of his concept of biopower, which we touched on before. How does that fit into this picture of governmentality?
Oh, biopower is a key element of governmentality. It's that form of power that's focused on managing life at the population level. Public health initiatives, demographics, even things like census data and birth control.
Yeah, it seems like biopower is less about prohibiting things and more about, like, optimizing and regulating life itself.
You got it. And this shift from what he calls sovereign power, like the power to take a life, to biopower, the power to manage life, that's a defining feature of modernity, according to Foucault.
Wow, it's fascinating how all these pieces kind of fit together. From archaeology and genealogy to discipline, the panopticon, governmentality, and biopower. He really paints this complex picture of how power works in the modern world.
He does, and it's a picture that challenges us to think really critically about how we're both subjects and objects of power.
It's a lot to take in, but it's so insightful.
Sure.
Before we move on, though, I want to make sure we touch on another really important part of Foucault's work, which is his analysis of sexuality.
Yes, his work on sexuality is essential, especially his critique of what's called the repressive hypothesis.
Right, that was a real eye-opener. The idea that the Victorians were all sexually repressed has always seemed, I don't know, kind of simplistic.
Yeah, and Foucault argued that modern society didn't so much repress sex as become obsessed with it. You have this explosion of quote-unquote scientific discourses about sex, medical, psychological, legal, and these actually create all these new ways to categorize and control people based on their sexuality.
So it's not that sex was silenced, it's more like it became this object of scrutiny and regulation.
Exactly. And this leads to one of Foucault's most, I think, radical ideas. Power isn't just about repressing things, but about producing them. Especially when it comes to identity, especially sexual identity, power plays a big role in shaping how we even understand and experience ourselves.
Could you give us an example of that?
Sure, think about all the categories and labels we have around sexuality today. Heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, transgender, and so on. These categories that aren't natural or timeless, they're products of these historical and cultural processes, often shaped by the very discourses that claim to be studying them objectively.
Oh, wow. So our understanding of ourselves as sexual beings is actually being shaped by the power structures around us.
Precisely. And this has big implications for how we think about freedom and liberation. Foucault argued that simply trying to throw off repressive norms, that's not enough because our desires and identities are already shaped by those norms in really deep ways.
That's a pretty challenging thought. It suggests that real liberation might require rethinking these very categories we use to understand ourselves.
You're getting it. And this leads us to Foucault's later work, where he turns his attention to ancient Greek and Roman ethics. He was fascinated by how people in those societies formed themselves as ethical subjects, and it's quite different from the Christian tradition that dominated Western thought for so long.
So what were some of the key differences that he found?
Well, both ancient and Christian ethics had moral codes, right? But the emphasis was different. Christian ethics emphasized strict rules, confessing your sins, whereas ancient ethics was more about these practices of the self and this idea of cultivating a beautiful life.
Oh, so there was this, like, emphasis on aesthetics in ancient ethics. That's really interesting.
Yeah, Foucault saw this as a way of shaping yourself ethically through things like self-control, moderation, the pursuit of wisdom. It wasn't about following a set of external rules, but about cultivating this kind of inner harmony and balance.
That's so different from the way we usually think about ethics in the West. Did Foucault see any value in this ancient model for, like, contemporary life?
He did. He thought it offered a potential alternative to the modern focus on individual rights and self-expression, which he felt could sometimes lead to a kind of, I don't know, maybe narcissistic self-absorption. He was interested in how we might cultivate a more ethical relationship with ourselves, one based on self-knowledge and self-mastery.
So it sounds like he was suggesting a more active role for the self in ethical formation, rather than just reacting to external rules, right? But this raises a question. If there's no true self to discover, as he argued in his earlier work, then how can we possibly cultivate and shape ourselves ethically?
Yeah, that is a great question, and it gets to the heart of some of the tension in Foucault's later work. He was wrestling with how to reconcile his earlier critique of the subject with this new interest in practices of the self.
It seems like he's pointing towards a new way of thinking about the self, one that recognizes both the ways we're shaped by power, but also this possibility for agency, self-transformation.
Exactly. Foucault's work, it's not about giving us easy answers. It's about challenging us to think critically about the ways power works in our lives and to imagine these new possibilities for freedom and self-creation.
Wow, we've covered so much ground today, from prisons and the panopticon to sexuality and ancient ethics. Foucault's thought is both challenging and incredibly rich.
It really is. And we're not even quite done yet. There's still more to explore, especially his later work on governmentality and what it means for understanding power in the modern world.
I'm ready for the final stretch of this intellectual marathon. Let's dive into part 3. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our Foucault deep dive. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And this part's crucial because we're really getting into the nitty-gritty of how power operates in our everyday lives, not just the big abstract stuff.
You mentioned governmentality last time, and I have to admit it sounds a little intimidating.
It can be, yeah.
Yeah.
But honestly, it's also super relevant to understanding, the world we live in right now. Foucault saw governmentality as this form of power that goes way beyond the traditional idea of, the state controlling everything.
So it's more subtle than just laws and regulations and all that.
Way more subtle. It's about how power shapes our conduct, our thoughts, even our desires. It works through all these different techniques and strategies that are woven into pretty much every aspect of our lives.
Okay, so can you give me some, concrete examples? How does this governmentality thing actually work in practice?
Well, think about how we're constantly encouraged to be healthy and productive individuals. The messages we get about diet, exercise, work-life balance, even self-care, all that stuff. Those are all part of this bigger system of governmentality that shapes our behavior and how we understand ourselves.
So it's not just about external control, it's also about us internalizing these norms and making them part of who we are.
Exactly. It's about becoming these, self-governing subjects who willingly go along with the dominant discourse. And this ties back to Foucault's ideas about biopower, you remember, the management of life at the level of the population. Governmentality uses biopower to optimize and regulate life itself, not just individual bodies.
It's kind of mind-blowing how all these pieces fit together. So where does the government part actually come in? Is he just talking about, the state with a capital S?
It's broader than that. Foucault saw government in this much more expansive way. It's about how we govern ourselves and others in all sorts of contexts. Families, schools, workplaces, even in our personal relationships. It's about how power is distributed and exercised throughout society.
So in a sense, we're all participating in this system of governmentality, whether we realize it or not.
Exactly. And one of the really key insights from Foucault's analysis is that governmentality always comes with a certain kind of rationality, like a set of beliefs and assumptions about how the world works and how it should be governed.
Can you give an example of that?
Take neoliberalism, for instance,
Yeah.
which Foucault saw as a really powerful form of governmentality. It's not just an economic theory, right? It's a whole way of thinking about human beings as these rational, self-interested actors who are always making choices based on cost-benefit analysis. And this logic extends to all areas of life, not just the economy.
Right, we're all encouraged to see ourselves as entrepreneurs of ourselves, always striving for self-optimization and efficiency and all that.
That's it. Neoliberalism shapes our economic lives, obviously, but also our social relationships, our sense of responsibility, even our understanding of what it means to be a good citizen.
It sounds a bit, bleak, to be honest. Is Foucault saying that we're all just cogs in this giant neoliberal machine?
He wouldn't put it quite like that. Remember, he always emphasized the possibility of resistance. And one of the main forms of resistance, he argued, is critique. Questioning the assumptions and the rationalities that underlie power relations.
So by understanding how power works, we can start to challenge it and maybe create new possibilities.
That's the idea. For Foucault, knowledge wasn't just about understanding the world, it was also about transforming it. By exposing these hidden mechanisms of power, we can start to imagine and create different ways of being and relating to each other.
This brings us back to that idea of an aesthetics of existence we talked about. It's not just about understanding ourselves, it's about actively shaping ourselves, crafting our lives in ways that resist those dominant norms and power structures.
Absolutely. And for Foucault, this process of self-fashioning wasn't just about individual liberation. It was about creating new forms of collective life, new ways of being together that challenge the status quo.
Wow, this has been an incredible journey through Foucault's thought. It really makes you think differently about power, knowledge, and the self.
It does. It's challenging, but it's so rewarding.
Hmm.
His work gives us these really powerful tools for analyzing the world around us and for imagining new possibilities for freedom and social transformation.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our Foucault deep dive. My brain is definitely buzzing, but in a good way.
I'm glad to hear it. Remember, Foucault's work is all about questioning, exploring, and never taking anything for granted.
Mm.
Keep those critical thinking skills sharp and keep pushing for a better world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Michel Foucault. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.